right, so go ahead and watch the video up here if you want to watch how the planets and the signs and kind of an introductory to evolutionary astrology works, but I'm going to go ahead and jump into the houses. So the houses of astrology are not quite as known as the planets and the signs, of course, but they are just as important. This is why an accurate birth time is so essential. So we'll look at the first house first. And what is the first house? Well, the cusp of the first house. Again, this is using Placidus as well. The cusp of the first house is the ascendant. So the ascendant we'll talk more about later, but it's kind of like a general view of what people see you as when they first get a glimpse of you, kind of the aura or the personality you emit on a first basis notice. But what does that represent? Represents just pretty much what I said. It can represent your looks as well. I don't think you look too far into this. Like, I'm a Libra ascendant technically, even though I do have Pluto kind of creeping over here on the dark side, drawing me in. Again, this is my chart too, without all the stuff. But yeah, apparently Libras are supposed to be really attractive and stuff. And well, you could be the judge. If I look like an attractive Libra ascendant, because we'll get into rulership and stuff more too. It is ruled by Venus. But the first house is associated with Aries, which mine are actually kind of opposite, because Libra is supposed to be on the descendant on the seventh house, and Aries is supposed to be on the first house. So it's kind of like how you assert yourself, your own personal motivation, your own personal drive. A lot of people argue that the first house is the most powerful house in astrology, and maybe so. I have Pluto, like I said there, and I also have Saturn. So that really gives me a very stoic demeanor and kind of going back to typology, kind of like an INTJ, if you will. Makes me very serious and solemn. Rather, if I had like Jupiter or Venus there, it kind of make me more extroverted or beautiful, or kind of wanting to accommodate to people and relationships a little bit more. So it just kind of depends what you got on the first house, but that's kind of the gist of the first house. Next, we'll go to the second house. So the second house is associated with Taurus. So just like the houses are going one by one by one, the signs go one by one by one. And yeah, so your birth time pretty much says where your houses are going to be lined up as. I use Placidus again. That's what we typically use in evolutionary astrology, and I think a lot of Western astrology uses Placidus, and it's uneven. Or whole houses, where I could just do a real quick view of what a whole house looked like. So you can see what Placidus looks like. Everything's uneven, like the sign cusp is right there, and the house cusp is right there. As you can see, now they're aligned. So if I was whole house, I'd looking at my chart as a whole house, I would be, well, I'd still be a Libra ascendant, but my first house would be up here. Then Scorpio makes things a little neat and orderly, but what in nature is symmetrical? You'll never find two trees. What in nature is symmetrical? You'll never find two trees that look alike, or two rocks. So I guess the only thing that is symmetrical in astrology is all the signs are 30 degrees, but maybe that's wrong too. There's a lot more we have to learn. But anyways, to get back on topic, the second house is associated with Taurus, like I said. And that is about your own body. It could literally be your own body. It could kind of show like if you're going to have health issues, possibly that is more related to the sixth house, which of course we'll get to. It could be your self-worth. It can be high self-esteem or low self-esteem. It could be about what you value. It could be about resources is the biggest thing about it. It's called the house of money, which it is a house of money, but I think that's a overgeneralization of it. It's pretty much the house of resources. So day-to-day resources that are necessary for life. This could be food, water, shelter. As I mentioned before, it could be love. Maybe you didn't get enough love as a kid. If you don't get enough love as a kid, as an adult, you're probably going to be in trouble and have a lot of mental health issues, and could be a lot worse. It just kind of depends. So it is just basic resources, your body, your self-worth, things like that. Next is the third house, which is associated with Gemini, which is also associated with communication, intellect, how you express yourself, how you listen, how you talk, how you communicate back and forth with other people. It could also be often tied to the house of siblings, like how well you get along with your siblings and what you got there. And it could also indicate early childhood experiences. I know one astrologer and I kind of got in debate with this, and he didn't think it did, and I really don't know. But that's just one thing that I heard is early childhood experiences, and that could definitely affect the way you communicate. Moving on to the fourth house. The fourth house is one of the angular houses. It is the cusp of the fourth house is called the IC or the nadir. Kind of like the cusp of the first house is the ascendant. And that is ruled by Cancer up here. So it's associated with the moon, which rules Cancer and the fourth house. That can represent kind of like your deep emotional undercurrents, kind of the way you need to be nurtured, the way you need to be secured, kind of what's going to make you emotionally fulfilled and happy. It could also, this line, particularly the IC, kind of shows like how you are behind closed doors in your own personal private home around the people that you're most intimate and dear with. Next, we'll go to the fifth house, which is associated with Leo and the sun. It is about self-expression, creativity, leadership, kind of how you express yourself in leadership. Actually, I need to change this back to. So it's about self-expression, leadership, creativity. It could be about romance and flings. It could be the house of love affairs. It's also the house of children. I know I was talking to one astrologer here, local in Tucson. He said kind of like if you're looking at your first child, you would look to see what's going on here on the cusp of your first house. Then you go to the seventh house, which we'll talk about more a little bit, which is a house of relationships. But next, we are going to talk about the sixth house, which is associated with Virgo and Mercury. So this was kind of dubbed by the ancients as the house of servitude. And I think back then, especially like if you look at India, where they had the caste systems, where some people were really high on society, like the Brahmins and the Kshatriya, and you had the people like the untouchables on the bottom. So it can kind of indicate slavery, but more it's like skills that you need to learn to serve humanity, basically. That's like what Virgo. It could also be the house of like medical issues, healing, and things like that as well, and skills, like kind of like how you learn skills and what skills you need to learn and things of that nature. Next, we're going to look at the seventh house, which the cusp of the seventh house is the descendant, and that is associated with Libra, which is the house of relationships. It could be the house of friendship, like they dubbed the house of friendship as the 11th house. That's kind of the generic name for it, but it's not really. It's kind of the house of community. Any type of relationship can come here: friendship, lover, sexual relationship, co-worker, mom, dad, parent, child. It's also the house of enemies, the house of contract, because as we talked about Libra, it's kind of about bureaucracy and rules and laws and things like that. And it's kind of considered the house of marriage and love because it is ruled by Venus. Next, getting really intense here, is the eighth house, which is associated with Scorpio. And the modern day ruler is Pluto, and the traditional ruler is Mars. This is the house of death. And again, we talked about Scorpio and we talked about Pluto. It doesn't have to be literal death. It can mean literal death. But it can be figurative death, like you're depressed and you kind of go on an exercise regimen. You decide you want to get 8 hours of sleep every night and you want to do things that are good for your health and drink plenty of water. So that can be like death of an old habit of sitting there sulking, eating Cheetos, watching Netflix in bed, miserable, getting too much screen time, to exercising, feeling better about yourself, and that depression lessens. It can also inverse things. Like you can see that my house, most of it is Gemini. I have my north node, my moon, and stuff here. So it can kind of inverse whatever's in there. For me, it's like social skills, communication. It could even be intellect, but that's not really the case for me. I felt stupid for a long time, so that could have been associated with it. So yeah, it can inverse things. It's also the house of taxes and shared resources. Like this is the house of personal resources. And as you can see, it's opposed each other, making that 180-degree aspect, which we'll get a little bit more into. But this is about shared resources, other people's resources. So it could be about like inheritances and things like that. On to the next is the ninth house, which is associated with Sagittarius, and it is ruled by Jupiter. So this is like the house of long distance travel. While you go across the pond here to the third house, which is something I forgot, that is like short distance travel that you can do within a day. This is long distances that take more than a day, and especially if it's over large bodies of water like oceans or maybe even rivers or lakes or things like that. It is the house of faith, the house of higher education and learning, the house of philosophy, the house of dogmatism and idealism. So it can be very dogmatic, like a religion, like, Catholic or Christian or Islam or whatever has real strict rules and regulations that's in it, and that can be associated with it. It's also the house of philosophy. Now we're going to the last angular house, which is the cusp of the 10th house, which is the MC or the midheaven. And this is kind of dubbed generically as the house of career. And it is ruled by Saturn and Capricorn. It's associated with Capricorn, I should say, and ruled by Saturn. But this is the house of career. As I said, it's your public reputation. It's kind of like how people view you in a societal whole, kind of like your overall arcing reputation of what people see of you. And it can kind of show good signs of like what you need to do for a living, what you need to do to kind of get a better reputation, or maybe you have a bad reputation. It shows why you have a bad reputation. Let's go to the 11th house, which is associated with Aquarius. And the modern ruler of Aquarius and the 11th house is Uranus, and the traditional one is Saturn, which I don't even consider Saturn. I don't understand it at all, because Saturn's all about rules and limitations and restrictions, and Aquarius and Uranus are about breaking those said rules, limitations, and restrictions. As I mentioned earlier, the 11th house is called the house of friends, but that is not really the case. The 11th or the 7th house is the house of friends. The 11th house is like the house of community. It could be like a group of coworkers. If you go to school, it could be your classmates. It can be a part of a club or organization you're in. It can be just whoever you associate with. If you're in the military, it's your military buddies, your superiors. It's kind of the people that you associate with on a day-to-day basis, but you don't have a close relationship to. It is a house of collaboration. It is kind of like I mentioned earlier in the last videos. Uranus is a higher octave of Mercury, because Mercury represents intelligence, communication. Uranus is more like abstract thinking, future thinking, and strategizing. Like my Mercury here is in the 11th house, so it's kind of supercharged, like an INTJ would have that future and I tinged thinking where they can plan and strategize and kind of have the next 10 years planned out for things. Well, I guess ideally and stereotypically that's the case, but not always the case. It's also like kind of midlife. It kind of shows like these houses kind of come into fruition after you start getting older. I just turned 40, so we're kind of going to see what comes of all that, I guess, because I have my Mercury and Venus there conjunct. Next is the 12th house, which is associated with Pisces. The modern ruler is Neptune, and the traditional ruler is Jupiter. So one thing I did forget to mention during this video, like we talked about the planets, that's the what in your chart. That's kind of like what's going on. And we'll kind of put this together later. The signs is the how, kind of like how it plays out, and what or where, I should say. The houses are where. It's kind of the public arena, like the arena that it plays out. And a 12th house can represent prisons, mental prisons, like your own thought patterns keeping you trapped. Maybe you have some depression or some anxiety that's keeping you as like a barrier of holding you back. It could also be literal prisons. It could be mental institutions. It's about mental illness, secrets, the house of secrets, the house of secure, the house of kind of illusion, delusions, psychosis, mental health, things like that can definitely show up in the 12th house. It's kind of seen as I'm sure if you are watching this and you didn't get mad because I went from typology to astrology, it is Jung called the collective unconscious, and the 8th house is the personal unconscious. So everything in astrology is archetypal, and the collective unconscious is kind of like where all these archetypes are stored, and they're displayed through movies and video games and books and articles and fables and poems and all that stuff. So that's kind of where all that stuff is stored. Well, that is a general overview of this. If you do want to get a booking, if you want to book a reading with me, go to nicholsastrology.com. It's not up as I'm making this video, but I do plan on launching at 5:30 Arizona time on February 25th, 2025. I was looking at auspicious time. Call me superstitious, but this is an astrology channel. So thank you for watching. On to the next.